HOA. Three simple letters that seem harmless, but to me, they represent a real nightmare. An organization born to maintain order. But in reality, it's just an excuse for power-hungry individuals to abuse ordinary people. Every email from HOA feels like a slap in the face, and every meeting is a mental torture session. I've lived under the rule of Karen Mitchell, a tyrant disguised as HOA president, for years. She doesn't manage, she controls. She doesn't protect, she punishes. And what drives me mad is that everyone else stays silent, accepts it, and bows down. But not me. I've been quietly preparing, because if no one else stands up, I will be the one to overthrow that rotten throne. If you're interested in dramatic stories about power, corruption, and the battle to protect the community, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any updates. I used to think that living in the suburbs was a dream. Green grass, white fences, friendly neighbors. But then I met Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, or rather, the dictator wearing the mask of a model resident. She doesn't manage the neighborhood. She rules it. Karen is the type of person who likes to control everything. The length of the grass, the color of the flowers by the door, even the direction you hang your hammock. One time, I put up a small flag in front of my house for Independence Day. The next day, I received a warning letter. The color does not meet HOA regulations. Are you kidding me? Even an American flag isn't allowed. But that was just the beginning. I have 3 cars. One is mine, one is my wife's, and one is a small truck I use for hauling stuff on weekends. All 3 are parked right in our driveway, not blocking the road, not bothering anyone. But then Karen showed up, her face as cold as ice. Do you know the new rule, James? Each household is allowed only 2 cars for free. The 3rd car must pay $600 a month. I laughed. They're parked in my own driveway, and you want me to pay you? She didn't laugh. A rule is a rule. If you don't like it, you can file a complaint. But I advise you not to waste your time. I was so angry I could hardly speak. $600 a month for a car parked quietly in my own driveway. It was pure robbery. And the worst part? Karen passed this rule without a vote. She only needed the puppets in the HOA board to nod along. This wasn't the first time Karen played such a dirty game. I still remember that night at 3 a.m. when I saw a shadow outside in the yard. It was Karen. She was measuring my grass with a tape measure. Later, I was fined for grass height exceeding the 1.3-inch standard. Another time, my daughter drew a few small pictures on the sidewalk with colored chalk. Hearts, a cat. The next day, another warning letter. Designs not in line with community aesthetics. What about Karen's friends? They can build porches that extend onto the sidewalk, keep chickens in their backyard, and even throw loud parties all night. But they never get a warning. Karen doesn't enforce the rules. She uses them as weapons, targeting only those she dislikes. And me? I'm public enemy number 1. Just because I opposed her at an HOA meeting 5 years ago. I said nothing. I didn't react. I just smiled and paid the fines. But each time Karen stepped on my neck, I remembered one thing. She would pay for this. I set up a shell company, Sunrise Properties. No name linked to me, no address. I started buying houses in the neighborhood. Houses from people moving out, divorcing, or going bankrupt. I didn't buy them cheap. I bought them at high prices because my goal wasn't profit. My goal was power. 5 years passed, and Sunrise Properties now owned 73% of the HOA. That means I, the one fined for a blade of grass, now held the power to make all decisions. But I wasn't in a hurry. I waited. I waited for Karen to cross the line. And now, when she demanded $600 for me to park my car in my own driveway, it was time for everything to end. Karen didn't know anything. She still walked around with her haughty posture, handing out warning letters like they were cookies. She thought she was the queen of the neighborhood, that no one could touch her. She was wrong. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to yell. All I needed was an HOA meeting and a file full of evidence. I had prepared my speech. I had photos, documents, bank statements, recordings. I had a financial analysis of the HOA with clear signs of embezzlement. And I knew, when I stepped up to that podium, Karen's entire world would come crashing down. You may have controlled this HOA for 10 years, Karen, but you don't control me. I walked into the familiar community room. The smell of bleach, the cold plastic chairs, and the welcome HOA residents sign made me want to vomit. How many years has it been? 10 years? 10 years I've sat here, listening to Karen ramble on as if we were attending a national conference, not a neighborhood meeting. I used to come because it was my duty. Now I'm here to enter reign. Karen sat in the chair at the head of the table like a queen. She wore cheap pearls and thick makeup, as if preparing for a TV appearance. Next to her were her minions, the HOA board she had put together, a bunch of people who only knew how to nod. I glanced around. The residents were still trickling in, some yawning, some checking their watches. No one expected that today would be the day everything would change. Thank you all for coming. Karen's voice rang out with fake sweetness. We'll be discussing adjusting some of the neighborhood maintenance fees. The same old voice, like honey dripping into ears, but full of poison. I'd also like to announce that due to many households using their front yards as parking lots, the HOA is considering raising the fee to $700 per month instead of $600. This is to maintain the overall aesthetics. I smiled. Just as I suspected, Karen didn't know when to stop. There were some murmurs from the crowd. An elderly woman muttered, $700? Are we living in Beverly Hills? Karen ignored her. She kept talking as if no one had the right to question her. I let her talk. Let her keep digging her own grave. I have some documents I'd like to share. I stood up slowly, holding a thick folder in my hands. Karen looked at me, hesitating slightly, but still trying to maintain her calm demeanor. Please sit down, James. If you have any complaints, you can submit them using the official form. I'm not filing a complaint. I'm changing the game. The room fell silent. I pulled out copies of the property ownership documents. One by one, I dropped them onto the table. Sunrise Properties, the company I own, currently holds 67% of the total voting rights in the HOA. That means from this moment on, I have the right to call emergency meetings, change management personnel, and request a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. Karen shot to her feet. This is abuse of power. You can't. Abuse of power? I laughed. Let me show you who the real abuser of power is. I started presenting, point by point, piece by piece of evidence. Photos of Karen measuring my grass at 3 a.m. A list of unreasonable fees sent to residents, mostly targeting those who had spoken out against her. HOA financial reports, dozens of suspicious expenses, first-class travel, upscale restaurants, even spas, listed as management team interactions. She tried to interrupt, but this time, no one supported her. You're making this up, Karen screamed, her face as red as blood. I also have bank statements. I slammed the final stack of papers down on the table. HOA's account has been regularly transferring money to your personal account, listed as internal coordination fees. The atmosphere was as heavy as stone. One resident stood up. We've been deceived all this time. Another one. I was fined $300 for leaving trash in front of my door for 10 minutes. Meanwhile, she's using HOA money for vacations. Karen started to shake. She knew. She had lost. For the first time in 10 years, Karen was forced to be silent. For the first time, the residents stood together, no longer afraid. A man waved a stack of receipts. Am I paying fees to feed parasites like you? An elderly woman screamed through tears. You once sent me a warning because I planted wildflowers. And this is what you call transparent financial management? Karen didn't respond. She just stood there, trembling, her lips tightly pressed together, her eyes lost like an animal cornered. I didn't need to say anything more. The crowd spoke for me. I proposed to remove Karen Mitchell from the position of HOA president. Does anyone second that? Everyone's hands shot up. Karen collapsed right there in the room she had once ruled. I thought after that meeting, Karen would quietly leave. But no, people like her don't know shame. She couldn't accept defeat, especially defeat at my hands. A week later, I received a subpoena. Karen Mitchell sues James Thompson for defamation, abuse of HOA power, and fabricating false information to harm her reputation. I laughed out loud when I read it. Reputation? Since when did a person who pocketed HOA money and committed financial fraud care about reputation? She didn't want revenge through the law. She wanted to cling to her decayed power. But she picked the wrong opponent. I didn't just have the truth. I had the blade of justice in my hands. I walked into the first court session calmly. Karen, on the other hand, arrived like a movie star on the red carpet. White suit dress, black sunglasses, 2 lawyers flanking her. The local press was also present, exactly the way she liked it. Noisy, dramatic, and fake. I just want to protect the community. James is the one manipulating power and is truly dangerous, she said, as though she were the victim. Her lawyer, a slick-haired guy with a shiny comb-over, tried to paint me as a real estate tycoon, here only to steal the HOA and destroy the community values. Listening to him made me want to puke. They had no idea I had lived in that so-called community value for so many years, where trash can place 10 centimeters out of line could get you fined $75. The community they built was nothing more than a fancy cage with chains made of HOA fees. When it was my lawyer's turn to present evidence, no one dared look at Karen with respect anymore. We submitted to the court an internal recording of Karen admitting to approving expenses without board consent. Text messages between her and her close friends where she ordered fines on neighbors simply because she didn't like their faces. A shady contract between the HOA and the cleaning company Clean and Shine, which, it turned out, was owned by Karen's cousin. The courtroom fell silent as they played one of the recordings. Karen, on the recording, do these neighbors think they have the right to speak? Pay the fees and shut up. Anyone who gets on my nerves, I'll just raise their fees until they break. Her lawyer went pale. The judge slammed the gavel, frowning. The court orders a review of the HOA's finances for the last 3 years and will also examine Mrs. Mitchell's personal responsibility for the opaque expenses. I looked at Karen. She couldn't say anything anymore, but her glare was still bitter, still unwilling to accept defeat. The kind of attitude, when the power is gone, all that's left is shameless resentment. In a last-ditch effort, Karen tried to bring in a few old residents as witnesses. People she had once favored, now summoned to lie because of old favors. An elderly man stood up, trembling, reading his testimony. I saw James threaten Karen at a meeting. What meeting? On what date? Is there a record of it? My lawyer fired questions at him. He stammered and couldn't answer. When the second witness took the stand, it got even worse. He misread the contents on the paper. The courtroom held back their laughter. The judge spoke sharply. The court warns the plaintiff against presenting fake witnesses. All testimonies will be cross-checked with HOA video records. Karen truly began to panic now. The proud face she once had was now contorted and pale. Lies couldn't hide the truth, and justice didn't close its eyes to a terrible farce. The final verdict came after 3 weeks of trial. The court finds the defendant, James Thompson, not guilty of defamation. The plaintiff's accusations are baseless. Furthermore, Mrs. Karen Mitchell is ordered to repay the HOA fund she misused and is prohibited from holding any position in the HOA system for the next 10 years. I sighed, not because I was relieved, but because it felt like the world had finally cleared a huge pile of garbage from a neighborhood. Karen didn't look at me as she walked out of the courtroom. She covered her face with a scarf and walked away, the residents' contemptuous glares following her. An elderly woman stood next to me and whispered, "Finally, Justice's eyes, James." I didn't answer. I just looked up at the gray sky outside. Karen thought she was the sky of this neighborhood, but in reality, she was just a poisonous cloud. And today, the cloud had dispersed. I thought that after Karen was toppled, the neighborhood would return to peace. I was wrong. She was gone, but her shadow still hung over everything like mold that couldn't be scraped off. Financial records, service contracts, even the security surveillance system, all a tangled mess that Karen had intentionally left behind as a final trap. She refused to give up. She wanted to see this neighborhood torn apart, even after no longer sitting in the HOA president's chair. And me, I was the one who had to peel each layer of filth off the community. The first week after the court ruling, I requested a full audit of all HOA records. The results nearly made me slam my fist on the table. Karen had signed more than 17 service contracts without board approval, at prices 3 times the market rate, with companies, most of which were owned by her family or friends. For example, landscaping services, $42,000 per year, yet only 10 bushes and 3 flower pots were actually planted. Streetlight maintenance services, a 3-year contract with a company that had only 1 technician. Snow removal services, paid monthly, even during summer. This isn't bad financial management. This is blatant vampirism of the residents, I said to my lawyer, so angry that I gripped the file until it nearly tore. It turned out Karen wasn't just a dictator. She was a professional thief disguised as HOA president. I organized a community meeting to announce the results of the audit, and it was nothing short of a riot. I've been paying HOA fees for 12 years to feed a parasite like this. A neighbor shouted, slamming the table, and I got fined for a rusted iron gate. While that money went to fund Karen's Bahamas vacation, an elderly woman choked on her words. The room filled with curses, outrage, and even some residents calling for a counter lawsuit against the HOA to demand compensation. I looked at the chaotic crowd and felt more sorrow than anger. Not because they were blaming me, but because I understood what had been broken: trust. Karen had destroyed not just the HOA system, but the residents' trust in fairness. The more I dug, the more I realized Karen wasn't a lone wolf. She had a network, the HOA Inner Circle, which included the HOA treasurer, who approved all invoices without verification, the head of welfare, who always abstained from voting in meetings, a few old homeowners who received fee reductions and exemptions in exchange for silence. I called them the Privilege Club, people who kept their mouths shut, benefiting from the entire neighborhood's costs. What are you going to do about them? One resident asked me after the meeting. I didn't answer, but in my mind, I already had a list. Cleaning up wasn't just about getting rid of the trash on the lawn. It was about clearing out the termites in the walls. I spent the next 3 weeks restructuring the HOA. I canceled all old contracts, appointed independent auditors, set up a residents' council to oversee. All expenses are now public. Organized a democratic re-election for all positions. Things began to fall into place. I went door to door, listening to every story, every frustration that had been buried for years. An elderly man who had been fined $300 for hanging the national flag on the wrong day cried when he saw that I had removed the rule banning flags outside homes. A single mother who had been fined for letting her child draw on the sidewalk with chalk now smiled brightly when I allowed the sidewalk to be used as a community play area. I knew there was still much to do, but at least Karen was no longer here to tear things apart. I looked at the neighborhood one evening at twilight. Maybe for the first time in years, it felt alive again. But I also knew, in the pile of ashes Karen had left behind, there were still embers that hadn't gone out, and I wasn't allowed to let go. One Tuesday morning, everything seemed to be heading in the right direction, until I opened the mailbox and found a sealed gold envelope, no return address. Inside was only one line. You thought Karen was the only puppet, accompanied by a photocopy of an old HOA contract, signed by someone I never expected, David Langston, former bank director and a longtime resident of the neighborhood. A chill ran down my spine. David, the one who had spent years pretending to be the middleman, always patting me on the back and saying, "James, don't stress, everything will be fine." It turns out, he was the one pulling the strings of the puppet named Karen. I began investigating David. That old man was nothing more than a fox in a blazer. He had once been a minor shareholder in a real estate development company. Yes, the very same company that had received tax breaks thanks to Karen lobbying for local policies. I traced the flow of money from the HOA to the account of a private company that David had once managed. The company's name sounded ordinary, Greenland Urban Solutions, but it was actually just a front for money laundering and capital funneling. Karen was just the shield. David was the one holding the sword. People like you only know how to make noise, but you don't understand real power. That was what David said to me in a private meeting when I confronted him. I didn't respond, but I knew the game had changed. A week later, in a temporary HOA board meeting, I felt something was off. The expressions of a few members had shifted. Those who had supported me now fell silent. I proposed ending all contracts with David's old company. No one spoke. No one voted. No one objected. Only a suffocating silence. We need more time to reassess, one member said, avoiding my gaze. I understood. David had started pulling the strings inside. Once again, I was fighting in a trench full of two-faced people. Less than 3 days later, the residents' forum was flooded with anonymous posts. James is trying to monopolize HOA power. James is profiting by appointing his own family members. Sunrise Properties wants to take over the neighborhood to restructure house prices. I sat there, staring at those filthy comments, disgusted. That guy is worse than Karen. At least Karen was open about it. We're being tricked again. Now it's just a different leech sucking us dry. I didn't know whether to laugh or to get angry. Lies spread faster than the truth. And David knew that. He didn't need to show his face. He just needed to sow doubt. I knew where I stood. On a ship that had just turned its wheel, and ahead, a violent storm. But I also knew I didn't come this far to stop in the middle. If Karen was a foolish dictator, then David was the power in the shadows, the dirtiest kind of person, because he wore fine clothes and spoke softly, but behind it all were the claws of a predator. I began to gather my forces. A group of loyal residents, a team of independent auditors, a new lawyer, with no ties to anyone from the old board. I wouldn't wait any longer. I was going to unmask David, right at the upcoming special meeting. This time, I wasn't just fighting a dictator. I was fighting an entire collusive, cowardly, and hypocritical system. Karen was the first battle. David was the real battlefield. I walked into the meeting room with a file as thick as a brick. No one laughed. No one greeted me. Only cold stares and a few contemptuous glances from David and his puppets. I didn't need anyone to applaud. I didn't need anyone's sympathy. I just needed the truth. And today, I would throw it in the faces of all those hypocrites. I'd like to start with a question. How many of you here think you're living in a free neighborhood? Silence. No one answered. I smiled. Good. Because if anyone still believes that, clearly, they've never read this report. I opened the file and pulled out evidence of money laundering, false declarations, and ghost contracts that David had signed over the past 4 years. David still tried to maintain his calm demeanor, but the sweat on his forehead was telling the truth. James, you're talking nonsense. Those documents are not legally valid. Is that so? Ask the independent auditors. They've already sent copies to all the residents. I threw a contract onto the table, a contract between the HOA and Greenland Urban Solutions, where David was a hidden shareholder. $30,000 per quarter for a consulting service that doesn't even exist? How do you explain this, David? David couldn't speak anymore. His mouth was tightly shut, his eyes darting around in panic. The rest of them started to stir. Some flipped through the documents more carefully. Others tried to avoid my gaze. Those who had been silent now began to feel nervous as they realized David's ship was sinking. I wasn't surprised when Karen suddenly walked into the meeting room. It was the same dirty trick she always pulled. James, I have nothing to do with David's actions. I was just following the instructions from the board, she said. I smirked. So those trips to Hawaii on the HOA card were also directed by the board. Karen went silent. I continued, not giving her a chance to twist things. You were used as a shield. Now that you've been abandoned, you come crawling back for pity? Sorry, Karen. Pity won't save anyone here. The residents murmured. A few people stood up, questioning her directly. You threatened the whole neighborhood. Now you want to deny responsibility. You fined Mrs. Jean for having her flower pot in the wrong spot. Now you want to beg for mercy. Karen lowered her head. The fury she had once spread now came back to drown her. I made my final proposal. I request that all members involved in the wrongdoing immediately resign from the HOA board, and that we hold a public, transparent election with independent oversight. Everyone nodded in unison. No one objected. David stood up, tried to resist one last time. You don't understand. James only wants to replace Karen with himself. This isn't justice. It's revenge. I stepped forward and looked him straight in the eye. You're wrong, David. This is the punishment you all should have received long ago. I don't need the throne. I just want to clean up the mess you left behind. The vote began. David, 100% voted out of the board. Karen proposed for civil liability investigation. And for the first time, the residents applauded. But not for me. They were applauding because they saw hope returning. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party. I went home, opened a can of beer, and sat looking at the street through the window. Silent. Peaceful. The very thing I had dreamed of for 5 years. But I also understood that any power can rot if it's not kept in check. I no longer believed in ideal justice. I only believed in the truth and transparency that can keep a community from decaying. Karen fell because of ambition. David collapsed because of the underground system. I survived because I no longer feared filth, only pretending to be clean. In the end, I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who lived long enough to expose those pretending to be righteous.